What's up guys, I'm Zach, welcome back to Workshop Edits. In today's project, I'm going to take you out of the shop and into my backyard where my wife and I will show you how we transformed this covered patio by installing some awesome looking mosaic tiles. Now this is a project that my wife has wanted to tackle basically since we moved into the house, and after a little bit of convincing with me, we went ahead and tackled it this past weekend, and I am so happy with how it came out. We'll walk you through the materials that we used, the tools that we needed for the project, some of the trouble that we ran into, and talk about the cost. But overall, awesome project, totally doable by a couple in a weekend, and yeah, super happy with how it came out, so let's go ahead and get started.
We've been slowly trying to fix our backyard since we moved into our home about a year ago. Growing grass, building extra storage. The first step to making over the common areas was giving the covered patio in our backyard a much needed upgrade. It was level and flat, so we were starting from a really good place. Brooke was really into the idea of creating a mosaic tile area to cover the old concrete. After some more research, I was convinced it was a great way to make over the area. Brooke did most of the tile homework on this one. What type of tile would work for our situation? A covered patio on top of concrete that was existing and had already cured many years ago. We landed on a really cool blue and gray porcelain tile, and the website we bought from was great in helping us estimate the amount of tile we needed. My recommendation for buying tile is, if your supplier allows returns, is always overbuy by about 20% to avoid having to go back to the store mid-tiling to buy more, which we did. Now I didn't film it, but the first thing we did was power wash the whole patio, removing debris, dirt, anything that had accumulated over the years, so we'd have a clean surface to work from. After it dried, I used a leaf blower just to do a final pass and get rid of any of the final dust. Prep was the biggest key to being efficient with this project. Make sure you have all your supplies and tools set up and ready to go, because once you start mixing that mortar, you're under a time clock. Now we aren't tiling pros, and we don't really have any of the tools you need to tile. Luckily, power tools for a project like this are pretty minimal, and we ended up renting a tile saw from Home Depot. It was about $88 per day. But if you plan accordingly, you can work to get all of your cutting done in a single day to minimize the cost. Now I'm using an outdoor rated mortar for tiles that are under 15 inches long, and it only needs water added in to get things going. About 5.5 quarts of water per 50 pounds bag. And if you're using a different bag or a different type of mortar, just check the instructions on the bag. It's super clear. Another tool we almost rented was a hammer drill to mix. You can do this by hand, but that would be a pain, and lucky for us, we were able to borrow one from a friend, so we only needed to buy the $14 mixing attachment for it. Mixing was simple. Add water, add the mix, blend for 5 minutes, wait 5 minutes, and then do another minute of mixing, and then you're set to go. Most important part of this project was getting the outside rows correct, as it was the main point of reference for the rest of the project. So we took some time laying out where pieces would go on the edges, making sure the overhang was correct so that when we put in the vertical pieces on the edges, everything lined up. When it was time to go, using a flooring trowel specific to the size of the tile we were laying, we could begin in the corner, first spreading out mortar and then coming back with the 1/4 inch notch side to spread out evenly. The point of this is to allow you to lay the tile on top of the mortar and push down to ensure even coverage underneath the tile. We read that 80% coverage on the bottom was ideal for indoor tile and 95% was ideal for outdoor. Since we are covered but still outdoor, we just aim for the maximum amount of coverage possible. Now, DIY tiling, in my opinion, is definitely a two-person job. While Brooke laid out and spread the mortar, I could position each tile in its proper place. Again, the outside row was key, so we took our time on this first line, laying each piece, lining it up properly with the edge, inserting the 1/8 inch spacers where necessary, and pushing down and working it into place to ensure even coverage of the mortar. I also went back with a level after 6 or so pieces to ensure things were flat wherever possible. Then it was just a lot of rinse and repeat. We got super lucky that somehow the end piece up against the wall required no cutting and left the perfect amount of space between the tile and the wall. We read that about 1/2 inch between the wall and the tile was ideal. Brooke would keep laying mortar, I'd keep laying the tile. We really got into a rhythm quickly with this, along with lower back pains and blisters on our hands. It's pretty amazing how a good first row with tiny spacers and a frequency of checking for evenness can lead to a very tight looking pattern. Once we started getting to the corner areas, we decided to tackle them so that we didn't work ourselves into a corner and then trap ourselves overall. This was the first time we had to start making cuts, and things slowed down a lot here. Lots of measuring, cutting to fit, then laying the piece in place. We couldn't really get into a groove here, but having two people certainly helped. Honestly, the toughest part was just making sure we measured properly and cut the pieces properly as to not mess up the pattern, which we did a number of times. Now, I forgot to film the installation of this, but while Brooke finished the corner pieces, I headed over back to the tile saw to cut all of the vertical edge pieces. Thankfully, our edge border was nearly exactly half the width of our tiles, so we wasted very few of them in the process of cutting them in half for the border. Corners were a little tricky. I originally planned to notch out corners with a diamond cutting wheel and my angle grinder, but the tile were thin enough that I could measure where needed, for example, around the step into our house, and then notching out each corner on the saw. And it helped to notch out each side and then flip it over to cut upside down, and at that point, the piece you cut off basically fell off. This corner around the post was probably the trickiest piece to cut. I knew that eventually it would have to be cut into two pieces, but the right way to do it wasn't all that clear to me until I got into actually figuring it out. I ended up measuring one side, notching it out on the table saw, and then laying it into place, and then notched out the rest of the post from that cut off piece and placed it in its final corner. It was simple in final design, but executing it cleanly took a lot of effort. In the end, it came out great, and it almost looks like a single tile. Now, a few months ago, we did a subway tile in our kitchen and had quite a bit left over that we unfortunately couldn't return. Somehow, those tiles ended up being the exact same height as our step. So we had the idea to do a white vertical border to help make the two levels pop and look more distinct. And this was great as it meant we could just apply adhesive to the sidewall and the backs of the tiles and hold it in place. And the reason we put extra adhesive on the back of these is because it would be in such a heavy foot traffic area. Last up was then doing the final step, which was just putting down 2 rows of the same mosaic tile, and we started in the corner that would be exposed the most as it helped make the step look the cleanest. And after spreading mortar for 8 hours, Brooke had definitely earned putting in the final piece of the puzzle. We then let the tile mortar cure for 24 hours, per the directions on the bag. Next up was grouting. Mixing grout was just like mixing the mortar. Add water to the dry mix. The color we used was called Alabastor white, I believe. Mix in for 5 minutes. Let sit for 10, and then start working it into all of the grooves. Now, this doesn't have the longest working time, so again, having 2 people working was hugely helpful. While I began applying grout to corners, Brooke went around to all the areas where we weren't as good and clean about applying mortar and used an old chisel to scrape off that mortar before we applied grout to those areas. Then, as she continued to apply grout, I could begin going over everything with a wet sponge. We read that you shouldn't apply more grout than you could come back to within 30 minutes and begin wiping off the excess material. The process for this is pretty simple in concept, but it is time consuming. The thought, as far as I understand it, is that you use a moist sponge with most of the water wringed out to wipe off the excess grout, then wash it in a bucket with water, wring out the sponge again to clean it off, and then repeat the process over and over again until you're left with only grout in the grooves and a really clean tile surface. I think we did 4 to 5 passes over the tile to get this right. As you can see in the final pass, we would do only 5 to 6 tiles at once, clean the sponge, and then repeat as to make sure we were working with as clean of a sponge as possible. And after 2 days and lots of long-term inflicted back pain, we were done. We learned a ton in the process, mostly that tiling can very much be a DIY project for beginners with the right preparation and lots of effort, and that most of the tools you need can be easily rented for cheap from your local Home Depot. We love how the final design came out, and it's amazing to see how much the space has already been transformed. Next up is painting those walls a different color. The banana cream yellow isn't doing us any favors. And Harley definitely agrees.